Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for today's Small Business Development Workshop, Media Relations Depositing into the Bank of Public Perception. The Chamber is very grateful to be able to provide this offering free of charge to our Chamber members because of the generosity of our sponsor, Lake Superior College. And Daniel Fanning has been super instrumental with getting this series off the ground. He's also our board chair. So Daniel Fanning at Lake Superior College has been wonderful. And we extend our thanks to him and the team at LSC for their sponsorship. But at this time, I am really happy to introduce our speaker today, Madison Quamme. Madison is a public relations and social media lead over at Flint Group, and she's tuning in today from Fargo. So we're really grateful for today's technology and you being here on this webinar. And she is well versed in understanding the strategies businesses utilize to stay top of mind within the local media. So thank you so much for being here today, Madison. I'm excited to learn some trade secrets from you. So you can go ahead and take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So excited to be here with you. As Chris said, my name is Madison Quamme and I lead our public relations and social media team here at Flint Group. I am located in Fargo, but we do have an office in Duluth, and it's so exciting, such an exciting time to connect with you all. Some background on myself. I've been in the industry for about 10 years. I've done everything from social media community management to strategic planning. And then the team that I work with, we handle everything from internal communications all the way to TikTok strategy. I'm sure everyone is trying that new challenge right now. But today we're going to dive into media relations and talk about some ways that we have found success when we are pitching to local media. So without further ado, we'll dive in. I'm a very informal presenter. Feel free to pop in and either ask a question in the chat or stop me. I'm happy to answer anything that might come to mind for you. So today we're really going to look at a couple different facets of media relations. So we'll dive into what media relations is. We'll talk about interview facilitation, what makes the news, pitch tactics and techniques, and then event media relations. So as we dive in, I want you to think mutually beneficial. The biggest thing with media relations is keeping the relationship mutually beneficial. So yes, you're trying to earn coverage with your journalists in your area or in the industry that you're working in, but you also want to provide really good content, and you want to be a really solid source that media thinks of you more than just for that one opportunity. You really want to build that long-term relationship. So think long-term, think mutually beneficial, and really look to be a partner for those people. We'll dive into some best practices at the end, but as we're thinking in this mutually beneficial landscape, providing tips like news tips for journalists, even when it doesn't relate to your organization, just sharing like, hey, I think this would be really helpful for you, or I think you'd really enjoy a conversation with this person, goes a long way, knowing that you're not just trying to sell your organization or the organization that you may be doing work for when you work at an agency like I do. So why media matters. I lovingly refer to this presentation as depositing into the bank of public perception. And the reason that I say that is because we saw very well in 2020, we all come across situations that are negative or maybe don't show us in the best light. So COVID is a perfect example. I don't think anyone anticipated that the whole world would be going through a crisis at the same time, but we were. So the companies that really excelled in those times were companies that had amplified their positive impacts and efforts going into that pandemic, meaning they had a high bank account of depositing positive into their communities, into their industries, into their audiences, so that when maybe there was a not so great situation like an outbreak, they had a really high balance in that bank account. And we want to make sure that we're keeping that bank account really high with all of the good that we're doing as an organization. So it's really easy to say, oh, I don't want to do media interviews. I'm nervous about it. My leadership is nervous about it. We don't want to talk about those sorts of things. We're humble. It's a very upper Midwest mentality for us. But we do really need to amplify those efforts so that we have that really big bank account. That's building your reputation. So think of a lot of what you're doing as reputation management or building a positive persona around your reputation. And then again, when you have that high perception of your brand or of your company, that balance, that high balance in a crisis situation really does help you navigate those maybe unflattering times. So one of the biggest things that I think in any marketing campaign that we don't think of is when you're going through the strategy and the planning is set key performance indicators. So what metrics matter to your organization? A lot of times for our clients, we're looking at number of views. So we want as many eyeballs on that media coverage as possible. Media relations, public relations is a brand awareness tactic. So we're not necessarily looking to convert, we're looking to reach as many people as we can. So number of views, number of eyeballs on that story is our main kind of KPI that we're looking to measure. That also usually relates to number of mentions. So while having a few mentions that reaches a lot of people is great, we also want to make sure that we have lots of mentions so that if people are consuming their news in different places, we're reaching them at least once, hopefully maybe twice. So maybe you catch it on the 6 o'clock news and then on your drive time the next morning on the radio. So think of different ways, different audiences, different media lists that you want to connect with. Sentiment is huge. So we talked about building a good positive brand perception, making sure that that reputation stays good in the community. You want to make sure that sentiment stays good with all of your news stories. So making sure that you're really focusing on the positive efforts, prepping your spokespeople, which we'll get into here in a little bit, to really talk about the good things that are going on with your organization. And then we also want to look at shares. Think of how many times news stories get shared from your local Facebook page for your newspaper, or maybe your local news shares it out on Twitter and it gets retweeted. We also want to think about that amplification of the story. Any questions on KPIs? Feeling good? Good deal. So the next thing that we need to consider is a media list. I would say in general, having a more inclusive media list than a less inclusive media list is really helpful. And you want to think through different areas. So maybe it's local, maybe it's regional, maybe it's national, maybe you're more so focused on an industry. I know I work in the egg industry a lot, so I'm far less focused on a geographical area. I'm far more focused in on the egg industry or business industry, depending on the story that I'm pitching. So think through your media list, think through who you want to reach, and then do your research. So really think about who's already covering these topics. Do some homework on maybe you have a beat writer in your area or in your industry that's already talking about egg and how you can connect with those people. Again, we're going to dive into best practices here and we'll cover this again. But one of my best pieces of advice is leading your pitch with, hey, I saw you wrote a story about XYZ. Here's a story that also relates to XYZ that I think would be really beneficial. So it shows that you're in tune to the fact that, you know, what they're writing about, who they're trying to reach, and kind of their style. And you're not just blindly pitching to them. You're connecting with them and you're showing that you have an appreciation for the work that's already been done. The other piece of this is don't discredit non-traditional sources. So influencers, bloggers, podcasters, subreddits, are there things that you can do to amplify your story with non-traditional media that's still going to get that reach? So like, for example, like I said, I work in the egg industry a lot, but healthcare is another really big one. A lot of times our healthcare clients, we can get them on podcasts or YouTube type shows, and we have just as much reach as if they were on the evening news, and we're reaching the people we really care about. So what makes the news? This is $1 million question, right? So you want to find the hook, like my Captain Hook little reference there. So you want to make sure you are timely and that it's relevant. You want to make sure that there's some significance or impact. If there's some sort of unique or oddity, like sometimes it can be like an anniversary. Like if you have a company who's made it 100 years in business or 75 years in business, that's unique, that's special. You want to make sure that it's relevant. Again, that goes back to that journalist and understanding what those journalists are already talking about, and then how it relates to the topics that they're already covering. Proximity. So if you have a story that's happening in St. Cloud, Minnesota, it probably doesn't make sense to pitch it to Duluth, right? Like, it doesn't really make sense for those two areas to want to cover that. So make sure that you're close, keeping it within a range, a geographical range where it actually matters to the audience. Human interest. This is my biggest piece of advice. People love talking about people. People don't necessarily love talking about businesses or companies. So how can you make your business goal or your company goal a human piece? Is there a case study you can use? Did your organization maybe help a person in your community through a tough time when they were struggling? And telling that story about how your organization impacted a person or people and can actually connect it to someone they can interview, someone they can talk to, that's huge. Trend stories are really big. If your organization, I think about like financial right now, we're going through some crazy economic stuff. And if you're in a financial organization and you feel confident to speak to some of those financial changes that are taking place, feel free to jump on the trends and share that as more of a thought leadership piece and get that coverage or that notoriety for your organization with your thought leaders. And then one that I like to stay away from is conflict. So conflict makes the news a lot. I think we see that, right? A lot of times the stories have to do with two opposing sides. I don't recommend leading with that pitch, but it is a way that you can earn coverage. And if you can prep your spokespeople accordingly, meaning they know what the talking points are, kind of where they can't go with those conversations, and you come at it from a really deliberate standpoint, it can lead to some really good coverage. I will just caution you with that one. So any questions on what makes the news, or maybe drop in the chat what you think your most newsworthy story is right now.
I don't necessarily have a specific question, Madison, but we get asked all the time as the chamber, we route press releases for our members, that's a member benefit. So they ask all the time, kind of like, how do I get the media's attention? So this is a really nice list. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think this one is helpful because it's all things that we know, but we don't necessarily think through when we're writing a pitch, right? Or when we're reaching out to the media. Ooh, I see Megan has a Bloody Mary fundraiser. That sounds very fun, and like the news would love to cover that, especially if it's coming up in the near future.
I was going to say that Bloody Mary fundraiser, actually, I signed up for that because I thought it looked interesting. The other thing that for me, sometimes I think, do people really want to know about this? And I might like downplay it. And so just trying to kind of have that barometer of what's interesting and what's not is not always easy. Like I had no idea that we had an event last night and Fox 21 showed up, and in my head, I was not prepared for that. In no way, shape or form was I prepared for that. And so it just, for me, it's like recognizing that in our organization, people are interested in what's happening. We're at the Upper Midwest Film Office, so film is kind of fun and people are excited about it. And to be ready for that, I think for me is like are people actually really interested in this? Kind of is the thing that goes through my head all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the world that I live in, if I have something that I think is maybe even just a nugget of interesting, I still pass it along to my journalist contacts. And maybe I'll use a smaller list, people that I know in the past have covered things that I've pitched that are similar or that kind of cover similar stories. But it is tough because you think, oh, everyone's kind of doing this, right? Everyone has an event until they show up, and then there's more going on. The other thing that I'll say with this is, and this is a little bit trickier and you have to be very responsive, but capitalize on a slow news day. So I've had situations where I've pitched a really good story, but then there's a high-speed chase after. Well, guess what? My story is not getting covered, even though it's a really good story, because all of the news crews are diverting their resources to something that's breaking news. So if you have noticed that maybe by 9, 10 o'clock, there's not a big news story going on that day, it's probably a better time to pitch than if you see that there was, like last night in Fargo, we had a high-speed chase that ended up with a shooting on the interstate. Terrible, terrible story, absolutely horrible. But that's not great for us when we're pitching because no one's paying attention to their email. They're really focused on the press conference that comes and talking to the highway patrol, and they have to focus their resources other places. Again, it's a tricky gamble, and I don't necessarily recommend doing that as your strategy, but consider it when you're pitching. So for example, as we're coming into November with the elections, I recommend not pitching more human interest pieces leading into the election unless it directly ties to something that's being voted on or how it could impact things, because it's going to probably get lost in the shuffle and you're going to feel somewhat disheartened by that. And you're probably not going to continue to follow up on your pitch because you think, oh, they don't care about it, when in reality, they're just completely swamped covering midterms or things that are coming up in the local election. Looking at some other examples, World Championships for track and field take place in Hayward Field in Eugene, Oregon. Duluth, Minnesota-based Lightspeed Lift was on the world stage for global athletes visiting Eugene. That's a super cool story and very human focused. So, but if you want to expand on this a little bit more, I'd welcome a little bit more detail on this.
Thanks, Madison. This has been fascinating so far, and I appreciate all the tips just within these first few minutes. Yeah, well, we've got a great opportunity for a local invention to make some press. It was something that was on network television. The question is, we do operate in one of your bullet points, which would be the niche market. And how can we get the press to understand the value of something that might at first seem like a niche piece? Because I think we're losing our opportunities because it could be in my language in releases or interactions. Yeah. And it also could be a lack of understanding for.
So I think there's a couple different ways you can approach it. My recommendation would be to kind of create a groundswell, right? So you would have maybe your media relations efforts going on with the publications who you know are already interested in these topics. So maybe there's a track and field publication that would be interested in it. Maybe there's a podcaster who talks about kind of this sports area. You know, I hate to say talk to a sports podcaster because that's very broad, but maybe there's someone who focuses really in on track and field. So talking to some of those people and getting the shares out on your social. So if you get coverage on a podcast, share that podcast on your social spaces. And then as you gain some of that awareness, it's easier to go through and say, hey, these 3 people already covered this. And the fact that they had interest, I think this could be really interesting to a broader audience because XYZ. Maybe it's because, you know, this national championship is coming up and, you know, it's more widespread and there are athletes from however many states coming through, but you're able to give yourself some credibility by focusing on people who already understand and appreciate what you're doing and it connects with them. And then you can, like I said, add to that credibility and share kind of with bigger publications as you grow your awareness. Yeah, absolutely. Aurora, missed opportunity from months ago. The Duluth Art Institute had a horse in our studio as a live model. Oh my gosh, that would have been a great story. The other thing that I love about this one, and Aurora, feel free to jump in, especially TV news and like your newspaper, they love visual stories. So think in terms of visuals when you're planning or when you're pitching and who you're talking to. It's like the radio can't come in and describe this horse as well as a TV crew could. So that helps shape your media list a little bit more. But when you have something this visual, that is awesome. I'm also not opposed to manufacturing these visual opportunities. So maybe it's the Duluth Art Institute's 25th anniversary and you decide to have 25 horses in as a live model. I don't know, I'm spitballing here, but those visual opportunities really allow for people to connect with your story in a little bit different way. Great, love these opportunities. Moving on. Let's see. So interview facilitation. Once you have got that interview, you want to make sure that you're there to support your spokesperson. So kind of a process or a timeline on how this works. You're going to send your pitch. That could be via email. That's my favorite way. I have really strong relationships with the journalists that I work with. So when my name pops up in their inbox, they know that I'm going to deliver a spokesperson who is reliable, who's on time, who's credible. We're not making things up. We're not fact checking after the fact. We'll provide any follow-up assets if needed. They know that when my name pops up, I'm going to supply them with a really good interview that doesn't take a ton of their time. So I email. You could also make a phone call. Maybe you have a better connection with someone in a newsroom locally, and you pick up the phone and say, hey, so-and-so, it's Madison over at Flint. You know, we saw each other however long ago at this other event. I have something else that I think is going to be really interesting to you, and connect that way. The last one, and one that I think you have to kind of feel out and is a little bit more nuanced, is to tweet at your source. So if you have kind of a professional Twitter and you are working, so I think of like this track and field opportunity. Maybe there's a really big track and field reporter at ESPN and you were just on a podcast. You could tweet at that reporter and say, hey, I know you're really into this industry. I know you're really into this sport. Here's a really great podcast, or here's a really great article that we were just covered in featuring my product and how it benefits track and field stars. You make a bigger splash. You're going to share your coverage that you've already earned. You're going to get your name out there a little bit more. My only caveat or my only caution with this is make sure that that journalist is using their Twitter professionally. So if they're tweeting about their family or their friends and not really about the work, and they're not really tweeting out, you know, things that they've written, I don't know if I'd tweet at them. That feels a little invasive and a little bit like you're crossing the line. But if they're tweeting their work and they're saying, hey, I just wrote this really great article about whatever topic, you can feel free to tweet at them, and maybe you respond and say, hey, that is a great article. I also think you'd be interested in whatever about your organization. And then you're able to connect with something they've already done with something that you're hoping they'll cover in the future. You want to make sure you prep your subject matter experts. So whoever is going to be your spokesperson, maybe it's you. A lot of times that happens. Make sure that you feel really comfortable with your talking points, how things are going to proceed, any sort of like cautions. So maybe, you know, this journalist really likes to talk about politics, and you work for a very politically charged organization. Make sure that you are ready to not talk about things that you don't want covered. We're going to get into prepping your subject matter expert here in a little bit, and we'll dive into that a little bit more. You'll facilitate the interview. So you're going to meet and greet. You're going to make sure that both parties feel comfortable, both the journalist and your subject matter expert, your spokesperson. As kind of the PR person in me, I always take care of follow-up. So maybe they're chatting and they go, you know, I'd really love a picture of that horse inside the Art Institute. Can you give me a good high-res photo of that? Yep, absolutely. I'll make sure that I do that. And I follow up really quickly and with as much information as I can. So again, I'm building that relationship, and I'm personally building that reputation of a reliable, quick source. And then monitor. Make sure you're watching for any of the coverage that you can find. Oh, Carly had a really great question. Can you expand on the difference between a press release and a pitch, and when to use one versus the other? Great question. Love that question. So think of a press release as being really a complete piece. So you're going to have a document. It's probably a Word document or PDF, probably has your company logo head, a media contact in it. And you're going to have a headline, probably a sub-headline, a date line, and then all of the content relating to your event. So like, or to your topic. So for example, maybe it's an event. You know, you're hosting something, a Bloody Mary fundraiser coming up, and you want to get that out. Maybe you are releasing a new product, or you're celebrating a new anniversary, or you're opening a new location. Those are all big events or big topics that would go into a press release form. A pitch is a more direct conversation or a one-on-one conversation. You can, you know, pitch to the masses, and we'll dive into that a little bit more. But a pitch is really a short, maybe 3 to 5 sentence email, a quick conversation on the phone, a brief tweet where you're saying, hey, journalist, I have a story that I think you'd be interested in. Here's why. And it's not as complete. The goal of a press release is to get that press release run in its entirety. You want that word for word printed. You want that word for word, you know, read on TV. A pitch is to facilitate a conversation. So you want, your goal then is to get maybe your CEO in front of the journalist to have a conversation. Maybe you want one of your clients in front of the journalist to talk about what a big impact your organization made on their lives. Does that answer your question, Carly? Perfect. We got her all covered. Any other questions? Feeling good? Good. So some pitch tactics and techniques. And I don't have a huge preference. Press release versus pitch. I think they both have their place, or excuse me, yeah, press release versus pitch. I think they both have their place. And I think you can consider a couple of things, kind of the scale of the topic that you want to talk about. Is it a really big event? Is it a really small? Good to know. That's kind of how I weigh it. The other thing is journalist fatigue. So I don't recommend sending press releases back-to-back weeks. And the reason that I say that is, while we would love for our client, our organization, our company, whatever it is that we're trying to promote, to be in the newspaper on the front page every time it's published, it's not going to happen. And you don't want to go back to a dry well. So have respect for your journalist contacts that they can't cover you every week. And make sure that you're thinking through when you actually want coverage. Like, you don't want to be the boy who cried wolf, right? So think through when you really want coverage, what's really going to be impactful. And maybe you can tie a couple storylines together. That's okay. The other thing that you can do is, if you pitch or you send a press release and it doesn't get covered, you can follow up with some additional information. So maybe you send a press release, they don't run it, but then the next week you follow up and you go, hey, you know what would be helpful when we're talking about that Bloody Mary fundraiser? I would love to put you in contact with someone who's benefited from the organization and how our fundraiser has made sure that they'll, I don't know what the Bloody Mary fundraiser is for. Maybe it was to make sure they had a warm place to stay for, 2 weeks while they got back on their feet, whatever that is. But you're able to add more information and entice that journalist a little bit more to hopefully get an interview or coverage. So think through that. Those direct pitches, like I said, they're very targeted to individuals. You want to make sure they're individualized so that your journalist contact doesn't feel like it's a spray and pray method where you're just sending a pitch to everyone on a media list. Like I said, I try to relate it back to something they already covered or a story that they've done recently. So they understand that you're doing your homework and you're not wasting their time, and it helps establish that relationship. Press releases can also be sent on an individual basis, but you can also mass deploy them. So maybe you have a media list of 100 people that you know would be interested in topics relating to your organization. You can mass deploy a press release and blind copy everyone and say, here's this news going out into the world. Let me know if you have questions. So like an example of a mass deployment would be, maybe you named a new CEO. So you know that's going to be newsworthy, right? You can send out that new CEO press release, and you're probably going to get the most bang for your buck that way because people are going to be interested in it. However, if you have something that's a little bit more small scale, you want to target journalists who are more pinpointed to what you want to talk about. You can use an email list, you can use a wire service. There's a cost to a wire service. I don't know if that's totally applicable. It's something we do use on like a national scale. I think that's a very specific application and something that we could talk through if you have questions with that. Event media relations. So this is one of my favorite. You've heard me many times say event in this. I love media coverage at an event, and it's because you get a lot of media there. It's kind of a press event, or it's tagging on a press event to another event, and you get to get a lot of impact or a lot of bang for your buck. So you'll want to actively watch for media to attend. Sherry mentioned how you got to be ready for it because you never know when they're going to show up. Our job as kind of the PR person or the person who's trying to earn this coverage is to approach the media and welcome them. You want them to feel really excited to be there, really happy, really welcome. You want to make sure that they feel like you'll get them whatever they need. Maybe it's a hot day and you offer them a bottle of water, or it's really cold and you say, step inside until, we're ready to shoot, or whatever it is to warm them up. You just want to be a good, hospitable contact for them. Again, you're thinking long-term relationships. Everything is beyond just today. You'll want to set up the interview. So you kind of maybe look at the backdrop, make sure that, like I said, I work in ag a lot. So maybe I want to make sure that the newest tractor is in the background when they're talking to the product expert. Or maybe we want a really great view of the event so that you can see how full it is and how many people are there. So you'll help set that up. A lot of times the journalist knows kind of what's going on and they'll have some thoughts too. And then you'll want to facilitate or babysit those interviews. So my role as a PR person, I'm looking to make sure we cover all of our key points. I'm making sure we don't say anything we're not supposed to. And I interject if there are things that we need to add. Like I said, we can assist that photographer, that videographer, and then make sure that you're socializing with them. Think of it as an opportunity to connect, build that relationship, more FaceTime. It's a good opportunity for you to build those relationships. Any questions on event media? It seems like we have a lot of events in this group, so happy to answer any questions.
I have a question, Madison.
Yes.
Should we do some kind of follow-up after an event or send kind of a recap if we're not seeing media attending the events? Is that helpful?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point and something that we've actually had a lot of success with. So let's say you have an event and media doesn't show up. We have gone as far as to collect our own photo and B-roll and even get our spokesperson answering a handful of questions on camera and then send a zip folder to the media after the fact, because the more packaged up you can have that content, the better. Newsrooms, especially coming out of COVID, are really lean right now. And a lot of times they want to cover things that they just don't have the manpower to reach. So if we can send them this neat little package in a bow that they can just clip and cut and put together a little package, it's really helpful. Did that answer your question, Chris?
Yes, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions with the events? Okay. Preparing your spokesperson. So I think this could be its own presentation in and of itself, but I think it's so important that I wanted to make sure we at least covered the high points in this. So first and foremost, messaging is like the biggest piece in preparing your spokesperson. I like to boil it down to 3 concise talking points or takeaways. And it's because your brain works better when you're thinking in terms of 3. And then I want my spokesperson to have anecdotes or stories and facts that support those 3 talking points that they feel comfortable enough pulling out on their own, right? So when I'm going through this process, I usually sit down with my spokesperson and I say, okay, we want to cover kind of these roughly 3 topics. Now, let's talk about those 3 topics in your own words. And the reason that I have them do it in their own words as opposed to me providing their messaging is it's easier for you to remember your own talking points than it is for me to tell you what to say, and then you remember it when you're nervous and stressed and in front of a camera. So I asked them to kind of prep them, formulate them. I'll give feedback. And then to have stories that support that. So if a journalist asks a follow-up question, they can naturally just say, hey, yep, that's a really great point. I had this really great experience with a client, a recipient, whatever that is, and this is what happened. Keep it simple, have them practice, but have them put it into their own words that follows what you want them to say. Some tips and tricks. And every time I talk about media training, I tell people, this is going to feel like a no-brainer. This isn't a duh moment, but actually thinking through these is really important. So smile, regardless of if it's a TV interview where you're actually on camera, a phone interview, a Zoom interview, a radio interview. If you smile, you sound like a happier person. Try it sometime. I jokingly say I have a coworker, and I was sitting in her office one time taking a call, and she had a mirror hanging kind of next to her phone. And I was like, kind of weird. She's kind of vain, but whatever, not my business. And I asked her about it later. I teased her about it later. She goes, no, I like to look at myself before I answer the phone so that I'm smiling. Because when a client calls, I want them to know that I'm happy. And if I go from being really focused in my computer to answering the phone, I maybe come across as crabby or ornery, when in reality, I just didn't take that pause to smile and sound happy. So some feedback for you there. Think before responding. This is the hardest one. I don't know why upper Midwesterners, we hate silence. So someone asks a question and you immediately have to answer. It's like, nope, take a second, take a breath, pause. It's totally fine. It actually helps if it's any sort of audio clip, whether that's TV or radio, because if you start answering when they're finishing the question, they can't use your whole sound bite. So give a second, a pause. Like when we have a videographer go out, we ask people to pause so that we have a clean break between your sound bites. So pause, think through it. Know when to stop. This is a journalist trick, and they will ask a question, you answer it, you feel really good about your answer, and then they sit there and look at you. And they just look at you. And you have silence, and then what is your natural inclination? You keep adding. You keep telling them more. And now all of a sudden you're word vomiting and you don't know why you can't stop talking. And we're just going to keep going down this road until you have completely lost the point or lost the soundbite or incriminated yourself. Hopefully not, but it does happen. Know when to stop. Silence is okay. Sometimes they're finishing up notes. They're thinking about the next question. They're processing that information. Silence is okay. Another tricky one, when you get to the end of that interview, you're going to be so glad that you are done. You're going to be like, oh, thank God. That was our last question. And journalists are going to go, is there anything you'd like to add? And you're going to be like, nope, I'm done. I'm good. I don't want to talk anymore. I want out of this situation. That's not the right answer. Give them some sort of call to action. Maybe it's come to the event. Maybe it's follow us on social. Maybe it's check out our website, call our dealer, call our office. Give them some sort of call to action at the end of that time. Keep going. Forget mistakes. I'm going to caveat this with, if you say something factually incorrect, correct yourself. So if you say that it was a 5-time world champion and it was actually 6, say, you know what, I told you 5, it was actually 6. And they're probably going to ask you to go through and correct that, assuming it's not a live interview. But it's okay to correct that information. However, if you stumble during your delivery, most people aren't going to pick up on it. What seems like a really big mistake to you is going to be really small when people are listening to it. So just keep going. And then stay calm. Again, easier said than done, but stay calm. Any questions on these tips or tricks? No? The other piece of this is know your medium. So we've kind of talked about 3 main, or I think most interviews can fall into 3 main categories. It's going to be some sort of a video component like a news or a pod or a vlog, maybe something going on YouTube. You want to sit up. You don't want to be too stiff, but you don't want to be fidgety. As you can see, I'm a hand talker. So when I do interviews, I really got to focus on keeping my hands down by my side so they're not flying in front of my face. We're living in a world of Zoom, obviously. So I would joke that we've got really comfortable with being in people's bedrooms, because how many people had their home office set up with a bed behind them? Be cognizant of what's behind you. Make sure that you have an appropriate backdrop. And then think about the camera angle. You don't want to be looking down at a camera or looking up at a camera. You really want to be thinking about that. And then I recommend connecting with the reporter before the interview so that you can build some sort of rapport. And it feels more like you're talking to a friend than maybe flying in right before it starts. You're running late and it's like, okay, we're on. And you got to talk to a total stranger about something that they really don't know anything about. So take the time, show up early, connect with them, chat with them. If it's Zoom, ask if you can do a sound check ahead of time with the interview so that you have those couple of minutes to connect. Next, with any sort of radio interview, you're going to want to sit really close to the microphone. I tell people it feels like you're going to eat that microphone. It is right in your face. You got to get really close and be okay with that. If you're dialing in, you want to use a landline rather than any sort of speakerphone or headset. The quality just isn't as good. And then if for some reason you take questions from callers, just treat everyone with respect. We're going to talk about bridging techniques on the next slide, and we can highlight some of those ways to maybe not answer the questions in the way that you want to. Bring your prep doc. If you're working with us, we provide this prep doc with you. It's going to have your key talking points, kind of who your journalist is, some backstory. So if you're prepping it for someone else, make sure that you have some backstory on like maybe topics they cover, or if there are things that you're maybe concerned about, a political slant, any sort of things like that, that your spokesperson has a really good idea of what they're walking into when they get there. And then make sure you're sharing any sort of supporting documents, statements, photos, graphics, anything to support your point that they can maybe publish. Bridging techniques. So there are two reasons that you're probably going to need this. I should say two most likely reasons you're going to need this. One is you have a journalist who is trying to work an angle and they want you to say something that fits the story they're trying to write. So again, we talked about midterms, politics. This happens a lot. Now that you've seen this slide, you're probably going to see it with politicians when they're being interviewed. They're going to ask you a question, and it's a question that is directive enough that you don't want to answer it. So my favorite way to get out of this situation is to say, you know, I think that's a really great question that you just asked. Maybe they asked about, I don't know, some sort of hot button issue that doesn't really relate to what you're there to talk about. I think that's a really great question. You know what's really important to focus on? All of the people that we're impacting here today by this charity event. And that's really what we're here to talk about, right? We're here to talk about the kids and how this is going to benefit the kids. You're going to acknowledge their question, and you're going to direct back to the talking points that you've already prepared. Most journalists are going to ask you this twice because they're going to think you didn't understand the question, and they're going to ask it in a different way. You're going to pick a different bridging technique and bridge back to what you want to talk about, okay? Usually they get kind of fed up after that second time. They realize you're not going to answer the question. It has nothing to do with understanding. The other time you're going to run into this, and Fargo and Duluth are very similar in this respect, both are feeder markets in the respect that it's a lot of young journalists who are trying to go to bigger markets. So they maybe don't have a ton of experience. They may be sent to an assignment that they don't really understand, and they're going to ask you a question and you're like, I don't know what the heck that has to do with what we're talking about here. And they're not trying to get at an angle, they just don't necessarily understand the topic or the event or something like that. And you're going to bridge them again back to what you want to talk about. So take maybe someone's inexperience or lack of understanding about the topic, and then bridge back to what you want to talk about and focus on your key points. Again, keep it in those 3 points, some of those stories and facts to support that. Any questions on preparing your spokesperson? Okay. So just some best practices. This is pretty short and sweet. We're wrapping up here. So my biggest piece of advice is know your journalists. Do they cover certain beats? Do they cover certain geographic areas? Are there certain types of stories that they like? Make sure that you understand that. And I've talked about that throughout this entire presentation, but I really think it's important to keep top of mind. And it shows your journalists that you're investing in this relationship just as much as they will be investing in this relationship if they choose to cover your topic. A way that you can do that is talking about what they've recently covered. This is an interesting tactic. It's called read and react, okay? So essentially what you'll do is develop your media list, and then maybe your top 5 to 15 journalist contacts you're going to want to stay really in tune with. So what I would do is on a weekly basis, I would look at my top 15 and I would read some of their articles. I'd see some of their tweets, things that they've shared. And then once I've spent some time consuming that, I would compliment their work. So maybe I'd send a note, and it had nothing to do with a pitch. I wasn't even going to pitch them for probably another 2-3 weeks. But I'd send them a note and say, hey, so-and-so, I just read this article you posted yesterday, and I thought it was really interesting because XYZ. Please keep sharing this great information. Your audience appreciates it. Keep it short and sweet. All you're doing is sending them a nice little kind note that the work that they're doing matters and that they're doing a good job at it. Because journalists get a lot of hate. People get really angry about things posted. So if you can be that positive, bright light in their day, they're going to remember your name. And then when you go back to them to talk about something that you want to talk about, they already have kind of that warm, fuzzy feeling, right? Like we're building up that bank account like we talked about in the beginning. So when we need something, when we need to take out of that bank account, we have a balance. The other piece of this is think social. So can you respond to a tweet? Can you retweet or quote tweet their article that they shared and tag them in it, or talk about what a good job it is, or why it's so important to the community, or why it matters to the industry? Amplifying their efforts when it doesn't have anything to do with you is just being a good partner. It's adding to that mutually beneficial relationship. So think long-term, think relationships, and think about ways that you can support them, that you can grow their audience, you can amplify the work that they're doing. And then again, we talked about KPIs at the beginning. At the end, we want to make sure that we're measuring against those goals that we set. So I recommend maybe a media monitoring service. We use Meltwater. If you don't have one, you can look at social media mentions. You can look at Google Alerts, which is a free tool that you can set up to just send straight to your Gmail account. There are ways that you can monitor your efforts without having to look at a news source or watch every outlet every night. So just keeping that top of mind so that you can then go back and prove your efforts at the end of your campaign or at the end of your efforts. Any questions?
Hi, Madison. I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you for answering my one earlier also. But so I just had a question. So I work for the Entrepreneur Fund and we're a regionally based organization. So we cover we're going to be covering probably about 25 counties here soon in northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin. And we're kind of just getting started with the media relation management and trying to invest in that more heavily. I'm just curious what your approach would be in terms of just getting those started. It feels a little, I wrote down, picking those top people and kind of just monitoring them, because it can feel a little bit like, where do we even start? And how do we start those connections when we're not really an event focused organization? We do hold them, but it's not really a big part of what we do. Yeah. But we have a lot of client impact stories because we work one-on-one with small business owners. So
yeah. Absolutely. Great question. So the fact that you said you're adding to your counties tells me that there's maybe some announcements that could take place from that, right? So if you start including more communities, it might make sense to send a press release to those communities and say, hey, we're here, we're excited to be here, we're excited to support small business, talk about who you are. So it's kind of your foot in the door press release to introduce yourself. And then hopefully people pick it up and cover it. And if they do, make sure that those people are on your list, right? Obviously they have an interest in what you're doing and you can go back to them to tell them more of these human interest stories. If I'm wrong in that assumption, which I could 100% be, I think spending some time looking at the publications that would reach those communities, and maybe it's someone covering the business section of the paper, right? That would be a really good person to reach out to and say, hey, I'm Carly, I'm with this organization, this is what we do. I think, we'd have some stories that would be really interesting to you, and start the conversation that way. If you're really bold, we do something called desk side tours. So we might pop over with a box of donuts or a cup of coffee and say, hey, I'm new to the neighborhood, just wanted to get you to introduce yourself, wanted to introduce myself, wanted to get to know you. Just wanted to, build relationships with the business community in whatever town you're in, and what content you'd be looking for and how we could support your efforts too, or better your publication as well.
Okay. No, that's helpful, because I do have an understanding of how busy everybody is in journalism. So I don't want to feel like, oh, I have to take everyone out to lunch or, that just doesn't feel realistic. So that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely not. They're very busy and I don't think you need that sort of investment either. But they also don't, like I said, get a lot of nice warm fuzzies. So anytime you can do something nice for them, it's really appreciated.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I was going to ask if there's any benefit in pairing with other organizations for releases, or if that just gets too confusing. As an example, Carly's at the Entrepreneur Fund. Our office is excited to support new businesses. So is there any benefit to doing that? Or would Carly say, and sorry to use you as an example, Carly, but
That's fine.
would she be like, would she capitalize on the opening of a brand new business that the Entrepreneur Fund supported? Or is that just too convoluted?
So I think if there's an opportunity, like maybe you guys are, maybe you're doing a joint event. You're doing a happy hour, like we do a business after hours in Fargo, and you guys are hosting it together. Then I think it's 100% fine to put together a joint press release and send and say, hey, we're so excited. If it's something where one of the organizations is kind of taking the lead and you just support the mission or the concept, or you're kind of all working towards that same goal, I think what can be really helpful is if Carly puts out a press release and it gets covered or it's on their website, then you take that and you share it to your social channels and amplify those efforts and say, hey, check this out. Like, we're so excited. We're supporting this. This is in line with our mission. It's kind of that third party credibility check for people who are maybe just dipping their toe into the pool of understanding what Carly's organization does or how it impacts the community. So I think it's good. I think the other thing that you can do is leverage relationships. So maybe Sherry has a really good relationship with the TV station and Carly has a really good relationship with the newspaper, and Sherry's trying to get coverage in the newspaper. She might say, hey, Carly, can you make an introduction? Because I know you have a really good relationship with the business reporter at the Duluth News Tribune. And then you're able to kind of leverage those relationships that way. And again, it goes back to that credibility check for journalists that, oh, I know Carly's a really good source and she provides me really good content. So she's saying Sherry's a good source. I know that's going to be worth my time and energy. And that's a lot. So we're a PR agency. That's a lot of what our value is to clients, right? Like, we're the credibility check in addition to the strategy and the understanding, and we work in it every day. But if we have an egg client come on, I can say, oh, well, yeah, I talk to Willie Voigt all the time. I'm going to just pick up the phone and call him. And you guys can leverage those relationships throughout your network.
I'm going to jump in. We have a little bit of construction, so I apologize if there's noise in the background. Two questions for you, I guess. So we are looking to hire someone specifically dedicated to public relations. And I know you mentioned KPIs specifically for the specific pitches. Any thoughts on for the role of it? Obviously you don't want them to be sending out a million different pitches, but just, in terms of kind of what would make that role really successful, I guess, in terms of measurement.
That's a good question. So I think it depends on when you hire and kind of what's going on with your organization and around your organization. So if you're hiring, like I've talked a lot about the election, and that's very specific. I tease that I never want to do media relations in a global pandemic during an election ever again, because it was the most disheartening time in my entire professional career. No one cared what I had to say about anything because there was so much other stuff going on. So thinking about kind of what's going on, I hesitate to set a goal for how many stories you should get or how many views you should get. I think what's better is to kind of do an audit of where you're at now. So maybe you are getting 10 stories a year, and take those 10 stories and, you can kind of estimate how many people saw those stories, and then say, okay, next year we want to increase our 10 stories a year to 15 stories a year. So I would make it about a percentage growth, as opposed to, like, we have clients who come in and they go, we want to be mentioned every week in 3 trade publications. And I'm like, no one can do that. Like, they're lying to you if they tell you they can do that. That's impossible without paying for it. So having a realistic understanding of growth versus an arbitrary number of mentions that you want. As far as looking for the position, there's something to be said about working with former journalists because of the relationships they have in place. We have one gal on our team who's a former journalist. And the way that she can call up her former colleagues and say, hey, I need you to cover this, versus me, who's been in the industry longer, and saying, hey, I need you to cover this, is very different. So keeping that in mind as well. We have a lot of recovering journalists on our team, I joke.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's super helpful just to kind of think through, what that looks like. The second question, just real quick. There's something to be said. We do have a lot of events here. So like coverage before the event versus during the event. Obviously, we would prefer before, just to kind of get the word out there from a marketing advertising perspective. Or both, getting both coverage would be great. But just kind of, it seems like the media and it might be the way we're kind of pitching it or not, is more interested in during the event. And it also might be a timing and everything like that. Any strategies or ideas in terms of getting them here beforehand when there isn't the fun aspect of it? And just any other ideas, I guess, from that perspective.
So it comes down to what's visual, right? Like if you invite media in to talk about an event on Tuesday before a Friday event, they have nothing to photograph, they have nothing to capture content of. It's really hard for them to put a package together because they can't just do a minute and a half of an interview with you. So thinking through, do you have, like, if you have an event coming up and you can't get media there ahead of time, maybe having your own photographer, videographer there that's capturing content in high resolution, so that next year when you pitch that event, you can go, hey, I know in the past, we haven't been able to get coverage before, but we'd love to preview it with you. I have all of these assets that you could build out a package with. Or maybe there's a sneak peek setup that you could, give them a glimpse of. And like I do all sorts of PR, and that makes me nervous. Like I don't necessarily want someone looking at my unfinished product and putting that out on, online where it lives forever. So there's something to be said about having content that you can give them or provide them so that they have it easily accessible and they're more likely to come in. Also looking for a scoop or an exclusive. So maybe you have concert venue coming or a concert coming with your event, or you have a musician. Maybe that musician can do some sort of live performance, or you can have them offer an exclusive interview to your MC for the night, or your local celebrity, or something like that. A family who's going to be there, the family of the hour. A lot of it comes down to how visual it is and what they can actually put together as a package.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any suggestions on the best time of day to send these out?
Good question. My advice would be find out when their editorial meetings are. So like I know what time Fargo my editorial meetings are, and if I want something covered that day, I'm going to make dang sure that my pitch is in their inbox before they go to that meeting. I'd say most of them happen 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. For local, when you're looking at more industry or niche markets, it's a little bit different. You have a little bit more leeway because they're working on probably a monthly calendar as opposed to a daily calendar. So thinking about, like, if you want to be in the July issue, realistically, that July issue is going to print probably early to mid-June. So in order to meet that deadline, you probably need your content there by end of May, beginning of June, meaning your interview is done, you've drafted your press release, whatever that looks like, because it takes them probably 2 to 3 weeks, or they're going to build out 2 to 3 weeks to go through content, layout, and design before it actually goes to print to make sure it's ready to go the first day of whatever month it is. So kind of thinking backwards and anticipating, not delays, but anticipating the work that goes into that. Anything else?
Fabulous. I'm not seeing any other questions. You're more than welcome to stay after another minute if you do want to connect with Madison, but otherwise, Madison, thank you so much.
Yeah.
This has been really wonderful and super helpful. I was taking notes myself. So we did record this session. If you wanted to go back and review it, I will send out that link to you when it is prepped and ready. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today, and then I hope you enjoy your afternoon.
And if you want, Chris, I know I sent along my social handles. Feel free to connect with me. I share a lot of content that I find that I think is helpful. And if it's helpful for you, I'm more than happy for you to find it through me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And everyone have a good day.
Thanks.